Welcome back to the After Action Reset. I'm Steve Geiger. If your mind never slows down, if you feel pressure nobody else can see, if you've learned how to function while quietly falling apart, you're in the right place. Let's get to work. A lot of people don't break down because of one catastrophic event. They break down because pressure quietly accumulates underneath functionality for years. That's what's happening. And that's why this episode matters. Most high-functioning people don't realize they're overloaded until the nervous system finally stops compensating. For a long time, everything still works. You still go to work, pay bills, handle responsibility, show up for people, get things done. From the outside, life looks stable, and internally, you convince yourself, I'm good. That's the trap. A lot of people measure their mental health entirely by productivity. If they're still performing, they assume they're okay. But functioning and healing are not the same thing. Huge difference. A lot of people listening right now probably know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been tired for a long time, but because you're still moving, you ignore it. You tell yourself, I'm just stressed. I'm busy. I'll deal with it later. I've handled worse. Meanwhile, the pressure keeps building underneath the surface. That's the message today. Most breakdowns don't look dramatic in the beginning. Usually they start quietly. Your patience gets shorter, your sleep gets worse, you stop enjoying things, you isolate more. Your fuse gets shorter, your body stays tense, you start emotionally checking out. But because life is still technically functioning, you dismiss the signals. That's where people get trapped, especially people who are used to carrying pressure. Military, law enforcement, first responders, parents, providers, entrepreneurs, high performers. People who learned keep moving no matter what, because eventually your identity becomes tied to endurance. You start believing, as long as I can still function, I'm okay. No. Sometimes functioning is just survival, wearing a clean shirt and pretending everything is under control. Some people look calm, disciplined, productive, dependable. Meanwhile, internally, their nervous system is hanging on by caffeine, stress hormones, and pure stubbornness, which, to be fair, has carried some people a surprisingly long distance in their life, longer than it probably should have. But eventually the body starts collecting the bill. That's what people miss. Chronic stress is sneaky because it rarely shows up dramatically at first. It whispers through irritability, exhaustion, numbness, tension, poor sleep, overthinking, emotional withdrawal. But because people still look functional externally, they ignore what's happening internally. That's why high-functioning burnout is so dangerous. Some of the most overloaded people you'll ever meet still show up to work, take care of responsibilities, provide for their families, make deadlines, stay productive. Meanwhile, internally, their system never fully powers down. Modern culture reinforces this constantly. People praise grinding, nonstop work, emotional suppression, hustle culture, productivity at all costs. Meanwhile, nobody talks enough about what happens when the nervous system never gets a chance to recover, because eventually the system stops compensating. And when that happens, people suddenly feel like they fell apart out of nowhere. But the truth is, the nervous system was sending signals long before the collapse became visible. That's what's happening. Some people listening right now have probably experienced exactly what I'm talking about. You held it together for years, and then suddenly small things started affecting you emotionally. Things that never used to bother you suddenly felt overwhelming. Your patience disappeared faster. Your emotional margin got thinner. And people misread that completely. They think, I'm getting weak. No, your system is exhausted. Big difference. One of the biggest misconceptions about burnout is this. People think burnout means you stop functioning completely. That's not always true. Some of the most burned out people you'll ever meet are still highly productive, still disciplined, still performing, still handling life. Meanwhile, internally, their nervous system sounds like a malfunctioning office printer. One tiny inconvenience happens and suddenly the internal operating system goes, error, paper jam, everything is falling apart. People laugh because they recognize themselves in it. Humor matters sometimes because one of the healthiest things people can do is pause long enough to honestly admit, okay, maybe my system has been running a little too hot. That awareness matters. Without shame, without self-hatred, just honesty. That's where recovery begins. Not pretending everything is okay, that's not what I'm saying. Not waiting until your entire life explodes. Awareness, that's the fix. And let's be clear about something. This conversation is not everybody's secretly broken. That's not the message. The message is that human beings are not designed for endless activation without recovery. Even elite systems need maintenance. People understand this with engines, vehicles, weapon systems, fitness, machinery. But somehow, when it comes to the nervous system, people think, I should just keep pushing forever. No system works like that. Not physically, not mentally, not emotionally. Eventually, the body starts collecting the bill. That's why some people suddenly develop anxiety, insomnia, emotional exhaustion, panic systems, irritability, emotional numbness. After years of appearing completely fine, they weren't fine. They were adapted. There's a difference. And adaptation can look incredibly functional for a very long time. That's why some of the strongest looking people are carrying unbelievable levels of internal pressure underneath the surface. A lot of people listening tonight probably became experts at hiding stress because somewhere along the line they learned, don't complain, don't burden people, stay composed, stay useful, and keep moving. And externally, that mindset probably helped them survive difficult environments for sure. But survival mode is not supposed to become your permanent operating system. That's the shift. Eventually, the nervous system stops negotiating. That's when relationships start changing. Emotional control weakens. Exhaustion deepens. Isolation increases. Alcohol or drug use increases. Emotional numbness increases. Now, people finally realize something's wrong. But the truth is, the signals were there long before the breakdown. Most people ignored them because they still looked functional externally. That's why awareness is so important. You have to learn how to recognize overload before collapse. That's real control. Not waiting until everything falls apart. And once you see the pattern, you start recognizing it everywhere. That's where the reset begins. Not after a catastrophe, before it. One of the hardest things for high-functioning people to accept is this. The crash usually starts long before the collapse becomes visible. That's what's happening. Most nervous systems don't suddenly fall apart overnight. They slowly lose capacity over time while the person keeps pushing through life pretending everything is under control. And a lot of people get rewarded for that behavior. That's part of the problem. People praise endurance, toughness, sacrifice, nonstop work, emotional suppression. Discipline matters. Responsibility matters. But there's a massive difference between discipline and self-destruction. A lot of people blur those two together, especially people who are used to carrying pressure professionally. Because if your identity becomes the reliable one, the strong one, the one who handles everything, then eventually slowing down starts feeling like failure. How many of you out there can relate to this? This is dangerous ground because now the nervous system never gets permission to recover, and eventually the body starts adapting to chronic stress as if it's permanent. That's when survival mode quietly becomes baseline reality. Now your system expects tension, pressure, overstimulation, hypervigilance, constant anticipation. And here's where this gets tricky. When stress becomes baseline, you stop noticing how abnormal it actually feels. Human beings normalize repeated experiences. That includes overload. That's why some people genuinely don't realize how tense they are until they finally stop moving. And then suddenly everything catches up. That's why some people emotionally crash after retirement, after deployment, after major life stress, after leaving toxic environments, after years of nonstop work. People think, but life is calmer now. Why do I suddenly feel worse? Because the body was surviving the entire time. Now the nervous system finally has space to reveal the damage underneath the momentum. That confuses a lot of people, especially people who pride themselves on resilience. They think, I've been through harder things than this. True, but survival and recovery are not the same process. You can survive something successfully and still carry nervous system overload afterward. That's incredibly common. Some people spend years unknowingly living in low-grade burnout, still functioning, still working, still parenting, still showing up. Meanwhile, internally, their nervous system is basically running Windows 95 with 42 tabs open while smoke slowly leaks out of the side of the computer. They're technically operational, but nobody should trust it long term. That's how some people live. Eventually, the system starts losing flexibility. That's when emotional regulation changes. Things that never used to bother you suddenly feel massive. Your patience gets thinner. Your tolerance drops. Your emotional reactions become faster. That's not random. That's physiology. The nervous system loses reserve under chronic overload. And when reserve disappears, small stressors start hitting like big ones. That's why somebody can survive years of pressure, function through chaos, handle major life stresses, but suddenly lose emotional control because somebody asked one more question, or the sink is full of dishes, one more bill showed up, or somebody cut them off in traffic. Or how about this one? The Wi-Fi stopped working. And suddenly, internally, your brain responds, this is how civilization collapses, which sounds ridiculous. Until your nervous system has been overloaded for 6 straight years, and now the microwave beeping somehow feels like a personal attack. People laugh because they recognize this, and it's important. Again, humor helps people recognize themselves without immediately drowning in shame, because shame keeps people stuck. A lot of people silently think, what's wrong with me? But the better question is, what has my nervous system adapted to? That changes everything. Because once you understand the system underneath the symptoms, you stop treating yourself like a moral failure every time you feel overwhelmed. Now, obviously, accountability still matters. You can't just say, well, my nervous system is overloaded, so everyone has to deal with me today. That's not what this is about. This is about understanding the mechanism underneath the behavior so you can actually start fixing it. Because if you don't understand the root problem, you'll spend years attacking symptoms instead. That's why some people think, I just need more motivation. No. Sometimes you need regulation more than motivation. Big difference. Motivation cannot permanently override a chronically overloaded nervous system. Eventually, biology wins. That's the part modern culture hates hearing. People want to believe more hustle fixes everything. More discipline fixes everything. More grind fixes everything. No. You cannot override biology forever. Eventually, the body collects the bill. That's why sleep deteriorates, anxiety increases, emotional numbness increases, alcohol and drug use increases, irritability increases, isolation increases. Not because people are weak, I will never say that, and I don't believe it. Because overloaded systems adapt in unhealthy ways over time. One of the biggest signs somebody is overloaded is emotional numbness. Not dramatic emotional breakdowns, numbness. That quiet feeling where nothing feels exciting anymore. Joy feels muted. Connection feels weaker. Life feels emotionally flat. A lot of people think this is just adulthood. Absolutely not. Sometimes it's nervous system depletion. That's different. And high-functioning people are especially vulnerable to this because they become experts at emotional suppression. They know how to keep moving, stay composed, stay productive, hide stress, perform under pressure. Anyone relate to that? I know I can. Meanwhile, internally, the emotional system slowly starts shutting down to conserve energy. That's why some people physically show up for life, while emotionally feeling absent from it. That realization hits hard, because eventually people start noticing. They're more disconnected. more irritable, more exhausted, less patient, less emotionally present. And relationships will feel this. Families feel nervous system overload long before people admit it verbally. Kids feel it. Your significant other feels it. The emotional atmosphere around somebody changes, even if nobody fully understands why, because overloaded systems broadcast pressure constantly. That's why some people say, I don't know why everyone feels distant lately. Meanwhile, they've been emotionally unavailable for 3 straight years while insisting, I'm just tired. And some people are tired. I get it. But sometimes they're not physically tired. They're neurologically overloaded. That's different. Until somebody understands that distinction, they usually keep trying to solve nervous system exhaustion with caffeine, distraction, alcohol, drugs, work, dopamine, stimulation, instead of actual recovery. Some people treat burnout with caffeine the same way medieval doctors treated illness with leeches. Just keep adding more and hope nobody dies. That's basically the strategy. And temporarily, this might work. That's why people stay stuck for so long. You can override exhaustion temporarily. You can numb stress temporarily. You can distract yourself temporarily. But eventually, the nervous system stops compensating. That's when people say, I was fine until suddenly I wasn't. But now you understand the truth. The crash didn't come out of nowhere. The signals were there the entire time. The nervous system was whispering long before it started screaming. And once people finally understand that, they stop waiting for catastrophic collapse before taking themselves seriously. That's where real recovery begins. Because the goal is not surviving until breakdown. The goal is learning how to recognize overload early enough to reset before the crash ever happens. And eventually, people reach a moment where they realize, I can't keep living like this. That's the turning point. Not because life suddenly got harder, but because the nervous system finally ran out of room to compensate. That's what's happening. For years, the system adapted. For years, it overrode exhaustion. For years, it stayed on. For years, it survived pressure. But survival mode was never supposed to become your permanent operating system. That's the shift. And once people realize that, the question becomes, how do you actually start taking control back? Because awareness matters. Understanding the nervous system matters. But eventually people need a path forward. Otherwise, this just becomes another conversation where somebody says, wow, that sounds exactly like me. And then nothing changes. That's not the mission here. The mission is awareness followed by action. That's the reset. And the first step is simpler than most people think. You stop treating stress signals like weakness. That's huge. A lot of high-functioning people spent years training themselves to override every signal their body sent. Tired? Push through. Overwhelmed? Push through. Emotionally exhausted? Push through. Can't sleep? Push through. And eventually the nervous system learns, apparently recovery is never coming. So now the body adapts for survival instead of health. That's why people slowly lose patience, emotional flexibility, joy, presence, connection, energy. Not because they're weak, because the nervous system has been operating in emergency mode for too long. And recovery is not weakness. Recovery is maintenance. Huge difference. Nobody thinks charging your phone is weakness. Changing the oil in your vehicle is weakness. Sleeping after a hard workout is weakness. But somehow people think nervous system recovery means I'm soft. Absolutely not. If anything, refusing recovery usually creates bigger problems later because overload affects everything. Your marriage, parenting, emotional control, sleep, focus, patience, physical health, leadership, all of it. That's why learning regulation is one of the most disciplined things a human being can do. Because emotional control does not come from suppressing everything forever. It comes from learning how to bring the system down consistently. That's the fix. And the fix is usually less dramatic than people expect. People want one breakthrough moment, one perfect routine, one motivational speech, one magical answer. That's not how nervous system recovery usually works. It's repetitive, small, consistent signals repeated over time. That's what retrains the system. Things like sleep consistency, movement, sunlight, hydration, breathing slower, reducing overstimulation, structure, emotional honesty, human connection. Those things matter more than people realize because every one of those sends information to the nervous system. And the nervous system is constantly asking, am I safe enough to stand down yet? That's the real question underneath all of this. And a lot of people never consistently answer yes. That's why they stay stuck in chronic activation. This doesn't mean life suddenly becomes stress-free. That is completely unrealistic. You can still work hard, lead, provide, stay disciplined, pursue your goals without living in permanent survival mode. That's the balance. And some people need to hear this. Being exhausted all the time is not a personality trait. Being emotionally unavailable is not a personality trait. Being constantly irritated is not always a personality trait. A lot of those patterns are stress adaptations. That's different. And what gets conditioned can also be retrained, as we've spoke about in previous episodes. That's the hope in all of this. The nervous system is adaptable in both directions. It can learn chaos, and it can learn regulation. But regulation has to be practiced consistently. That's where people get stuck. Because recovery feels boring sometimes. Chaos feels dramatic. Recovery feels repetitive. Nobody makes movies about going to bed on time, drinking water, getting sunlight, touching grass with your bare feet, or breathing techniques. But half the internet would probably heal faster if they slept 8 hours and stopped treating caffeine like a food group. That's the reality. And no, those things don't solve everything. Trauma exists. PTSD exists. Major stress exists. Life gets heavy. I get it. I understand. But overloaded nervous systems still respond to consistent regulation over time. That's biology. A lot of people don't need more intensity. They need stability. Big difference. Because some people have spent their entire lives trying to outrun overload instead of learning how to regulate it. That's why slowing down feels uncomfortable at first. Your system got used to chaos. Stillness feels unfamiliar. That's why some people say, I don't even know how to relax anymore. And that may actually be true neurologically, but it doesn't mean you're stuck there forever. Some people listening to this right now don't need more motivation. They need their nervous system to finally feel safe enough to breathe again. That's the reset. And if you've been listening to this episode thinking, damn, this sounds exactly like me. Good. Not because you're broken, because recognition creates opportunity. Once you see the pattern, you stop blindly living underneath it. That's where recovery starts. Awareness, then action, then repetition. That's how nervous systems change. Not overnight, over time. One better habit at a time. One honest conversation at a time. One reset at a time. That's a huge reason I started the After Action Reset in the first place. Because there are so many people silently carrying unbelievable pressure while pretending they're okay. People who still look functional externally, while internally their nervous system is screaming for recovery. And most of them think they're alone. They are not. That's why these conversations matter. Real conversations, not fake positivity, not motivational fluff, not pretending life is easy. Real conversations about stress, burnout, trauma, emotional overload, recovery, discipline, regulation, rebuilding control. Because once you understand what's happening underneath the surface, you stop blaming yourself for every symptom. Now you can finally start rebuilding the system itself, one habit at a time, one reset at a time, one honest moment at a time. And if this episode hit home for you, don't just listen to it and then move on. Actually do something with it. Subscribe to my YouTube channel because we're building long-form conversations here for people who are tired of surface-level mental health advice and fake motivational nonsense. Follow the After Action Reset on Spotify and Apple Podcasts because every week we're breaking down stress, nervous system overload, burnout, PTSD, emotional numbness, discipline, recovery, high functioning pressure. And follow my TikTok page because we're posting daily short form clips designed to help people recognize these patterns quickly and start understanding what's actually happening underneath the surface. Because the truth is, a lot of people think they're broken, when really their nervous system has been stuck in survival mode for too long. That's different. And once you understand the difference, everything starts changing, one reset at a time. I'll see you on the next one.